Welcome to today's True Crime Podcast. Please take a minute to like or subscribe my channel. Today's story is about a young man named Chandler Halderson. Outwardly, he had a good life. He had a nice girlfriend, had a great junior role with an insurance company, and after completing his IT degree, he was on his way to start his dream job at Elon Musk's company, SpaceX, in Florida. In the summer of 2021, life couldn't be better for him. Although his life was outwardly on track, a few mishaps had occurred lately where Chandler had fallen down the stairs and hurt his neck. He had to wear a neck brace for a while and was feeling a lot of numbness in his legs. He was worried he wasn't going to be able to fly to Florida to start his training for his new job. His girlfriend could sense that he was tense. He was sending her multiple text messages about being worried that things wouldn't work out for him. But she was more upbeat and positive and was urging him not to worry. She encouraged him to help her look for apartments, as it was her plan to join him in Florida. She couldn't be more excited about their future plans. It was the 4th of July weekend, and Chandler's parents had planned to go away to their family cabin up north. Chandler would have the house to himself, where he planned on entertaining his girlfriend Kat. His parents had been picked up by friends early that Friday morning, and although Chandler was happy, he was also frustrated as his mum had left him a long list of chores to complete. Coupled with the dogs being stressed and anxious by the 4th of July fireworks, he had planned to invite his girlfriend over for a much-needed help and support with the dogs. Later on that Friday afternoon, a work colleague of Chandler's mum, called Dan, had stopped by Chandler's house looking for his mum. Strangely, she hadn't shown up for work that day, and she hadn't answered any of his texts. He was naturally worried about her. Knocking repeatedly, Chandler had eventually answered the door and told Dan that his parents were up north for the weekend and that they'd return on Monday. Dan left the house and told Chandler to let him know when he hears from his parents. In fact, he and Chandler texted a few times over the weekend, and as Chandler was at a loose end on Sunday evening, he even ended up going to Dan's house to watch the fireworks. Chandler mentioned that he'd talked to his parents that day and that they would definitely return on the Monday. So Monday and Tuesday came and went, but Chandler's parents never returned home. Dan, his mum's work colleague, had called Chandler again, since not only was his mother expected back at work, she also had an important doctor's appointment she had missed. The whole scenario was slightly worrying. He encouraged Chandler to contact the police, worried that his parents may have been in a car accident and possibly weren't able to get back home. Clearly something wasn't right. Chandler walked into the Dane County Sheriff's Office on Wednesday morning, reporting his parents missing. The detectives let Chandler leave after he filed the initial report. They told him they would meet him back at his house later. Arriving at the house, the detectives were invited in. Chandler took them through the whole house and pointed out the things that his parents had taken with them. The detectives didn't see anything unusual, and Chandler also mentioned that his parents didn't take their own car. They in fact had been collected by a couple in their car, and they were all planning on driving to the cabin together. And whilst not unusual, given the luggage and the length of the weekend, it did seem odd that they would only take one car. The detectives left the home to kick off the start of their investigation. The family cabin was a lakeside cottage 3 hours up north. Bart and Krista's parents had built the cabin in the 1940s, and Mitchell, Chandler's brother, was also worried about his parents, so he and his fiancée decided to drive up to the cabin to see if he could see any sign of his parents or see any reason why they hadn't come home yet. On arriving at the cottage, they were actually met by local police, as they'd already been alerted to the missing couple. Mitchell and his fiancée knew the cottage well and showed the police where the main front door was and where the cottage had access to a lake. As they walked around the property and ultimately gained access inside the property, they could quickly see that no one had been there in a very long time, certainly not recently. This concerned them. Back home, Chandler was going door to door asking neighbours if they'd seen any sign of his parents or had any doorbell footage that may help him. He was keen to help the investigation and bring his parents home as soon as possible. The press picked up the story, and soon the story of Bart and Krista's being missing was all over the news. Journalists were in contact with Chandler, and as his brother was at the cabin, he spoke to journalists alone. He was quite nervous, so he insisted on only his voice being recorded, as he didn't want to be on camera. He relayed the story of when he last saw his parents, and clearly was in shock about the whole situation. He couldn't wait to hear news from the police. As the story reached the local community, people were reaching out to the police to pass on any tips regarding the missing couple. A local woman, who in fact was related to Chandler's girlfriend Kat, had called to say that Chandler had visited her farm that weekend, and although he was allowed to visit the farm, he'd never been there alone before. And while she didn't think this was suspicious, she thought it was unusual and decided to call the police anyway, just in case there was a connection. The police responded to her call by attending the farm, and whilst not suspicious, they did wonder why Chandler hadn't mentioned that he'd been at the farm over the 4th of July weekend. They were directed to the area where Chandler had parked up his car, and at the same time back at the sheriff's office, their colleagues bring in Chandler once again, as something about his actions and movements that weekend wasn't quite making sense to them. Chandler once again relayed his activities that weekend and told the detectives he'd spent some of the 4th of July with his girlfriend. He was taking care of the dogs and working through a number of chores his mum had instructed him to do. He also went on to explain a cut on his hand, which occurred when one of the dogs had lunged at the fireplace and had smashed one of the fireplace panels. On clearing up the glass, he managed to cut his hand quite badly. His girlfriend had also stayed over, and she helped him by bringing him some provisions for the weekend and to help him with some of his chores. Chandler explained that the dogs were very anxious, so they spent the whole night in the lounge, sleeping on the lounge chairs. Back at the farm, the police are still surveying the land. They immediately spot something very worrying. Birds of prey are flying overhead in a spot just at the boundary of the land near to the farmhouse. They walk over to the spot to examine why the birds were hovering. Was there a dead animal on the land? They were not sure. They venture further into the bushes, and after removing some of the brush, to their horror and amazement, they discover the partial human remains of an adult male. Detectives are shocked. They do not immediately know how to process what they've just seen. They cordon off the area and report back to their colleagues, who are midway interviewing Chandler. He's carrying on with his story, relaying his movements about his weekend, and as the detectives hear the news from their colleagues, they know that Chandler is now a person of interest in something they can't quite figure out yet. Was that his father in the woods? Could he have killed his father? But where is his mother? Could she have killed her husband and Chandler's covering for her? They really didn't know what to make of the scene. They carry on with the interview, and in another room a second interview is going on with Chandler's girlfriend Kat. She talks about their weekend and their movements. She's worried about the Haldersons. She's asked about Chandler and whether she noticed anything odd about his behaviour that weekend. She said his parents were away and that it was his job to look after the dogs and take care of the home chores. She'd stayed over Saturday evening and had brought Chandler some provisions to help him clean the house, along with some ice for drinks. She's asked if she thought Chandler had anything to do with his parents being missing. She looked utterly shocked and appalled and said absolutely not. He had so much going for him, SpaceX, etc. There's no way he would jeopardise that. He loved his parents, and they loved him and his brother. Meanwhile, the police have no other option other than to arrest Chandler, but at this point they only arrest him for lying to police about his whereabouts, as they've yet to identify the remains on the farm. In the following days, the remains found are officially identified as belonging to Bart Halderson, and shockingly his autopsy shows that he was shot twice in the back of his body. Detectives ramp up their investigation and find some troubling information about Chandler. He had for some time been lying about a number of aspects of his life. His college life, his work life, his prospects at SpaceX, everything unfolded as a lie. He didn't have an internship at American Family Insurance. He hadn't finished his college degree. and he hadn't been offered a job at SpaceX. And further investigation would show that Bart, his father, was on his son's trail and was very close to finding out about his elaborate lies. Detectives feel this is their much-needed motive. Chandler's whole life was slowly imploding. But where is Krista, Chandler's mum? The police continue to follow up on tips, and during their interview with Kat, something interesting comes up. Chandler had cheated on her during the early stages of their relationship. She'd insisted on using Snapchat so she could always see his location. Over the July weekend, she had noticed that during one of her Snapchats with Chandler, that his location was over 20 miles away. She took a screenshot of his location. It was somewhere along the Wisconsin River, somewhere where they'd go swimming during the summer months. At the time, she thought it was odd, but didn't raise it with him right there and then. She made a mental note to raise it with him later. Police take a screenshot and look up the location on the map. They immediately send search teams and scour the area for clues, but there was no sign of Krista or indeed her remains. They take a break and try one more area before they leave the scene. It's not long before they find something, and to their horror, they discover 2 sets of body parts. These are later tested and found to belong to Krista Halderson, Chandler's mother. Chandler Halderson is subsequently arrested for the murder of his parents. He went on trial for their murders in January 2022, and phone calls from the jail prior to the trial show that in the early stages of his arrest, his girlfriend Kat and her mother actually stood by him. It's difficult to determine when this changed, but when Kat testified in court, it was obvious that she and Chandler were estranged at that point, and that she was traumatized by the events and having to testify. She wore a mask in court and cried throughout the whole proceedings. It was very emotional. The murder weapon was thought to be a gun that a friend of Chandler's had gifted him. His friend also testified in court. He'd met Chandler online through playing computer games, and Chandler had lied to him too. He also believed Chandler was working and was at college, and the gun had been a gift, and he gave it to Chandler thinking it would be well received. He had no idea it would be used in a double murder. Chandler, showing his denial and arrogance, went to trial, but did not give his own evidence. He was stoic and quiet during the whole trial, and even when he was found guilty, he said nothing. He showed no emotion. During his sentencing later in March 2022, he was sentenced to serve life in prison without parole. To the amazement of detectives and relatives, he spoke at his sentencing and asked that if any lawyer would help him with his appeal, that they should get in contact with him. The family and community were staggered by his comments and his pure arrogance and outward lack of remorse. This whole story is truly unbelievable. The web of lies that Chandler Halderson spun is shocking. If he'd only put as much effort into his studies and job hunting as he did constructing his elaborate lies, he could have been a very successful person. He kept up this pretense for months and months. His parents, his girlfriend, her mother, his brother, his friends, family. No one had any idea that his whole life was a lie. The reason I covered this story is due to the shock factor. From what everyone says about Bart and Krista, if Chandler had only been honest, there would perhaps have been some initial fallout, but his parents would have forgiven him and helped him to get his life back on track. There is so much to cover about this case. In terms of the evidence against Chandler, they found blood at his parents' house. They also found a shell casing from the gun his friend had given him. And more shockingly, they found bone and teeth fragments in the family fireplace. Chandler had made up yet another story about his hand being cut by one of the glass panels. He blamed this on the dog. It is thought that he had dismembered his parents at home and burnt part of their remains in the fireplace. The heat from the fire was so overwhelming, the fireplace panel had actually shattered. As well as finding Bart's remains, they'd also found some of the bloody tools that Chandler had used to dismember his parents. And having studied the Ring doorbells in the neighbourhood, his parents, after arriving home on the Wednesday evening, were never seen leaving the house ever again. The evidence in this case against him is overwhelming. It's difficult to understand his choices. Whether he actually planned out their deaths, we won't ever know. He's a complex character, and one that I doubt we will ever understand. He has, to date, continued to deny his involvement, which, given the evidence against him, is truly bizarre. I doubt we will hear much of him again. It's so very sad. Two much-loved people cut down so early in their life. His brother lost his parents, and I doubt he will ever come to terms with what Chandler did. Rest in peace, Bart and Krista. If you're interested, you can watch the whole trial on the Court TV archive. The opening statement alone is worth watching. Just want to say thank you for listening. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to my channel. I'm hoping to switch to videos in the very near future, and if you'd like any particular stories covered, please say in the comments, and I will try my best. Thank you as always.